Welcome to Psychology Reconsidered, a podcast dedicated to exploring psychology, mental health, and the science behind human behavior. My name is Doriana. I'm a clinical psychology PhD student and the host of this podcast. Together, we'll dive into psychological research, challenge common myths and misconceptions in the field of psychology, explore how mental health fields have evolved in both research and clinical practice, and discuss practical insights that can be applied to everyday life. Through my own experiences in clinical psychology training, as well as the conversations with researchers and clinicians and other experts to be had, will bridge the gap between science and real life while learning from credible evidence-based sources. So whether you're a mental health professional, a student, or a trainee, or simply anyone that is curious about psychology, my hope is that each episode will leave you with a new perspective, a practical insight, or a question worth thinking about. And together we'll explore ideas and challenge assumptions and reconsider what we think we know about psychology. Just as a disclaimer, this podcast is designed to make psychological science and reputable mental health information more accessible. However, the information shared is for educational purposes only and is not intended to provide therapy, diagnosis, or individualized medical or psychological advice. In today's episode, we will have an honest conversation about what it means to pursue a PhD, specifically in clinical psychology. And perhaps I can start off by giving a little bit of a background about what my academic journey has looked like so far. So I completed my undergraduate degree and got basically all the pre-med courses, so all the biology courses, the chemistry courses, the psychology courses. And it wasn't until my third year of my undergraduate program where I got exposure to running experiments, putting together experimental designs and carrying out those designs and putting together posters for conferences and those sorts of things. And that's when my initial interest in research was sparked. And I always had this underlying kind of curiosity about psychological research specifically. So understanding why we think what we think, understanding why we do what we do, especially when there was some psychopathology involved or some mental health component in the picture. And so that actually led me to apply for my master's degree in neuroscience, which I completed for 2 years. And through that, I really realized that I would like a career that allows me to continue on with research, but also has a clinical aspect that I can actually pursue clinical work down the road in addition to doing the research that I was so excited about. And that's when I decided to apply for several different programs all across Canada in clinical psychology, being well aware that it is a very, very competitive program and likely would take me several rounds, application cycles to potentially be successful. And so I ended up applying to a variety of different schools, which I will be discussing in just a moment here. And that led me to where I am today. So I am now pursuing my clinical psychology degree. And today I will be talking a little bit about my experience with the application process, my experience of completing a PhD in psychology, as well as the other kind of tips and tricks and experiences that I've heard from the peers in my program. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the pre-PhD phase. So everything from applying and the considerations and those sorts of things that I had in play. So when thinking about applying for PhD programs, like I mentioned earlier, it's a really, really good idea to apply to as many programs as possible. I believe the success rate for at least schools in Canada now is anywhere between 1% to 3%, which is quite small. And so applying to a variety of different programs and not limiting yourself geographically is probably your best bet to potentially secure an interview. There are serious considerations that need to come into play, including choosing what sort of research you want to do, which supervisor you want to work with, what lab you want to join. And I remember when I was in this phase, of the PhD journey, I treated this almost like a part-time job. So there were different phases that I divided this chunk of time into, and it spanned all the way from the summertime to the fall time, as most applications, at least in Canada, are due in November or December. And so I really, really ensured that I had a good chunk of time that I could devote to putting together these applications. In this process of preparing applications and submitting applications, I strongly believe that there is such a thing as the right time and place. And in fact, there also is such a thing as the right formula for putting together these applications. Now, it may look very different for everybody, but there are certainly things that you can have on your CV or in your cover letter that increases your likelihood of actually securing an interview and later on actually getting an acceptance. Something else to note is that it actually is much more probable that you will have to apply when you submit applications to these competitive PhD programs. And this is just a hard pill that is to swallow for many applicants, but right now it's more likely than not because of the nature of the competitiveness of the programs. And on average, it'll take applicants 2 to 3 cycles to secure interviews and potentially secure a spot in a clinical psychology program. So we'll now talk a little bit about kind of what I've gathered from my own program and my own experiences of actually completing the clinical psychology PhD program. And just as a side note or a disclaimer, this is my personal experience. There is a lot of variability and a lot of diversity across how these programs look like in Canada as well as in the States. And so just speaking from my own personal experience. So the first thing that I want to touch on is what a general PhD program looks like. So for the most part, there are 4 different types of domains that will be involved in your PhD training. The first one being coursework, the second one being your research / your dissertation. The third one is the clinical work. And then there's this other bucket. More often than not, these domains will follow a consistent trend in that it's usually front-loaded with coursework, and the amount of coursework really does depend on the program. I'm aware that there are programs across Canada that have full course loads for the first 2 years. There are also other ones that have very, very limited coursework per semester, which makes it more manageable in the sense of prioritizing and focusing on your research first and foremost. And then the clinical work is introduced at least halfway through the program. So once again, there are specific courses that need to be completed within the program. There are also specific number of clinical hours or practica hours that clinical psychology trainees need to complete before they apply for something called residency after their training. Now, there's also this other piece that I mentioned earlier, and that includes a variety of different things that PhD students are often involved aside from their coursework, their research, their clinical work. And that includes things like being involved in mentorship opportunities or junior supervision, which essentially is when a senior PhD student takes on an undergraduate thesis student or perhaps a more junior master student to mentor them. There's also scholarship and grant applications that is expected for the most part for students to apply for and put together applications for. There's also a lot of collaboration and other projects with other students within the lab or perhaps across different labs. And there are often also admin and program requirement things that PhD students need to do. In addition, there is something called supervision that students complete, sometimes on a weekly basis, sometimes on a monthly basis, depending on the structure of your lab and how your supervisor operates, which essentially is regular touch base with your supervisor, your principal investigator in the lab. And then there are also something called committee meetings, which are regular annual meetings that you have with other professors or faculty members that are involved in your research, and they are there to ensure that you are progressing at an appropriate pace, and so that your research looks good and that it's ready for that defense that happens at the end of your PhD as well. Of course, sometimes people take on other extracurricular involvements, academic involvements, those sorts of things. And then, of course, the knowledge translation piece, which is those conferences that you may prepare and attend and those sorts of things. Now, I wanted to share a little bit about my experience and perhaps some of the challenges that I came across while pursuing my PhD in clinical psychology. And I think a common one for most students, if not all, is that ability to manage priorities and manage tasks. I will say that from my experience, completing a PhD isn't per se hard. That wouldn't be the word that I use to describe completing a PhD. I just think it is a lot of work, but the work itself isn't hard, especially if you're enjoying what you're doing. And so what I found is there's a lot of things to manage, and you have to be really, really good at managing. Otherwise, it's very easy to fall behind, to fall off track, and those sorts of things. And if you're a person like myself who has a really, really hard time to say no to opportunities, that will also be a very, very steep learning curve for you as well, because there are a plethora of projects you can be involved with, a plethora of papers you can collaborate on. And so you have to become good at saying no to certain things and acknowledging what your priorities are and what you hope to get out of your graduate training. Something else to consider is that completing a PhD, especially in clinical psychology, it really is a marathon, right? So I really felt like my patience has been tested. It's not a sprint. Data collection takes long. The write-up takes long. Everyone works at different speeds. You are depending on all the other members within your project. And so it is a long process. And that is something that we have to accept as we are completing our training. And lastly, it really does take a village to complete your PhD. Something that I learned quite early on is the importance of finding friends within your cohort to be able to bounce ideas off of, to be able to kind of share similar experiences, get advice on. And in addition to that, of course, staying connected with your friends that are outside of academia to really get a nice refresher and some downtime in addition to your family as well. Some other challenges that have been shared by my peers is accepting an offer into a lab where you have very, very limited interest in the research. The one thing about a PhD program is that you will be there for at least 4 or 5 years at minimum. And so you want to ensure that you are picking a topic or picking a program of research that you are at least somewhat interested in, right? Otherwise, it will make this experience much more dreadful, much more challenging. Related to that, as clinical psychology PhD programs combine both a research aspect as well as a clinical aspect, I have heard of individuals sharing their lack of interest in research as a whole, right? They just wanted to complete their PhD in clinical psychology and just become a clinician. And that's fine. However, going through, once again, 5 years at minimum and not enjoying the process of research, that will become really, really challenging. So just wanting to do a little bit of a reality check before you even consider applying about whether research is something that you can at the least tolerate. But definitely enjoying research would give you a more fulfilling and enriching and enjoyable experience. Once again, there are so many things that we are juggling at the same time as PhD students, and more often than not, there is a lack of direction, and managing your own schedule and time becomes the center. And if you are the type of person that regularly procrastinates, saves research till the very end, you may end up in the program for way longer. And so my tip is to identify a style of working and progressing through this PhD program that works best for you so that you aren't falling behind, and really becoming good at time management, prioritization of tasks, as well as preventing burnout. So balance becomes really, really important in graduate training, not just in PhDs involving clinical psychology, but in all forms of graduate training, because it's very easy to burn out. There's always something to do. Weekends can easily fill up with work. And so from the early stage, identifying ways that you can find balance between school and personal life, you'll be better off that way. Something else that I've learned throughout my academic journey so far is the importance of self-advocacy. One can easily end up where they don't want to be necessarily if they don't communicate their desires, their needs, their training goals. And so it's really easy to fall through the cracks if you don't speak up for yourself. And of course, there is time and place for everything. And there are certainly things that you can't control within your graduate program. However, if there are any bits of things or ways that you can advocate for your own goals and for your own self, those are really, really important to identify early on in your program as well. Now, there are some pointers that I want to just mention when considering about pursuing a PhD in clinical psychology. Now, of course, this is not an exhaustive list, and unfortunately, it's not black and white, but there are some considerations that are worthwhile noting here. Now, the first being whether you love or at the least like being a student. So have you always been one of those people that considers themselves to be a lifelong learner, one that likes to read and write and learn something new? If so, certainly pursuing a PhD will be much easier and likely more enjoyable for yourself. The next thing to consider is, can you see yourself handling the marathon? Once again, it's not a short trip. It's quite long, burnout happens, and so just really reevaluating your desires, your needs, where you see yourself. Are you good at managing your work, your time, and your responsibilities independently? I cannot stress this enough, but you truly will be the pilot of your own plane, for the most part, during your PhD training. Now, of course, there are differences in what type of supervision style your supervisor has and what your program and how your program manages. But for the most part, there's a lot of independency and autonomy when you are completing your PhD. And so really reflecting on what kind of person you've been to this day. And if you feel like you're one that has always been able to manage your time and your responsibilities well, graduate training will be a breeze for you, at least from this perspective. Now, the other aspect here to consider is whether there is something you are decently passionate about at the least. Once again, you will be focusing on this program of research for at least 4 to 5 years. So you definitely want to make sure that you are doing something that you're really passionate about. When it comes to completing your dissertation, essentially, you will have to do a lot of reading on a given topic. You will have to conduct some sort of study on a given topic, and you will have to write about that study in the context of the literature on that given domain of research. And so you want to pick something that you are decently passionate about, if not extremely passionate about, to make this experience worthwhile, enjoyable, and as least distressing as possible. Always good to also consider the personal and practical sacrifices that you will have to make while completing your PhD. Perhaps finances and where you are geographically, and whether you're okay with being further away from friends and family if your program is a little bit farther from home. So definitely things to think about, as there will be at least some sacrifices that you will have to consider. And lastly, long-term career aspirations. Something that perhaps is not communicated as frequently in undergraduate training is that there are so many different ways to get to a similar outcome. So for example, if your overall goal is to just provide therapy, You can consider other programs that are shorter, don't involve research, such as psychotherapy or counseling. If you're strictly interested in research, there are experimental psychology streams that you can consider instead. If you are more focused on that psychopharmacology aspect, so treating individuals with medications, there's the MD route, so going through medical school. So definitely having a reality check about what your long-term career aspirations are looking like. Now, I just want to end off by talking a little bit about my decision with pursuing my PhD in clinical psychology, as well as perhaps things I didn't know or wish I realized earlier, whether that's during the application period or earlier in my PhD career. And the short answer to whether I'm happy with the decision I made to pursue my PhD in clinical psychology is absolutely. I genuinely do not feel like there is a better fit for anyone that is interested in both research as well as clinical work than a PhD in clinical psychology. You really get exposure to both. And so if you're one of those people that has always been interested in combining the research with the clinical work, a PhD in clinical psychology is an absolutely phenomenal option for you. Now, I will say that I did quite a bit of proactive research. So I had a good expectation of what I was walking into before starting my PhD. However, there were little tidbit of things that I realized once I got into my program that would be helpful to know earlier on at the time of application. So the first was that I actually did not realize all the variability in programs across Canada and in the States. So what I mean by that is there's quite a bit of heterogeneity in terms of what each program at each university specializes in. So that would certainly be a little bit more helpful for me to know when making my decision. So things like, what are the forms of different treatment modalities that the programs emphasizes their training on, whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT for short, or dialectical behavioral therapy or DBT for short, or is it IPT or is it psychodynamics? So again, just becoming familiar through communication with faculty, through communication with supervisors, through communication with current students to really understand what the main treatment focus is would definitely be much more beneficial for me in hindsight. Something else that I wasn't as clear on or as aware of is that as a clinical psychologist, you can choose to further specialize in another area of expertise or competencies. So that includes being a neuropsychologist, a forensic psychologist, a health psychologist, and I would highly recommend you to do the research in advance so that you can proactively start to pave your own path as early as possible in your PhD training, depending on any subspecialty that you want to consider or truly go ahead with pursuing. Another pleasant realization I had is that the volunteer experiences that I had starting from high school into undergrad did actually indeed add up later. And this particularly became most important when it came to applying for things like scholarships. So I would really urge you to not underestimate the value of those, as they will become a little bit more relevant when you are submitting applications for scholarships. Another note I want to mention here is the importance of becoming a really good storyteller and writer as early as possible in your graduate training. Become really good at explaining succinctly what you want to explain, not only to the science audience, but also to a lay audience. If you have that skill honed, you are that much more closer to securing grants, to securing scholarships, to getting your manuscripts published. Become a really good storyteller. Thank you for listening to the very first episode of Psychology Reconsidered. I hope today's episode gave you something new to think about, a practical insight to take away with you, or perhaps a belief worth reconsidering. Until next time, stay curious, keep asking thoughtful questions, and don't be afraid to reconsider what you think you know.